Chapter 4. Comanches Strike Again. That was a summer of Indian alarms and raids, and something besides. When Reed and Giles got home from chasing Indians, they were both burning with fever. "It's that bad water you've been drinking out there on the plains," Mother diagnosed their ailment. But this opinion changed a day or two later when both of them woke up with a bright red rash that got worse as the day wore on. "Measles!" Mother then exclaimed. "Not one of you children has ever had the measles. Some of these new settlers have brought it into the country, I reckon. Now every last one of you will catch it." Reed groaned. "I always heard measles was a youngster's disease. I never dreamed it would make a person feel as bad as I do." Mother was not too sorry. She would have her boys at home for a while now. "It goes harder with grown folks than with young ones," she said. The next thing the rest of the family were down with it. Ben Atkins, then Travis, then Thad. Mother and Father Conway had already had the disease, so they were immune. So was Charlie Bjorn. Thad had never been sick in his life to speak of, and he felt he was making up for all the diseases he had missed. They were all well enough to be up and sitting around when they had their worst attack from the Comanches. Came just before daylight. All the day before Little Bit and Blue Hornet had been nervous and fidgety. When Charlie brought in the cows from across the creek, he said, "Mr. Conway, I feel like there is something wrong." "How's that?" Mr. Conway asked. "Several things," Charlie said. "First, I heard a turtle dove calling from over in the open country. That was on my left. It didn't sound much like a dove either. Then suddenly away over to my right, at a good distance, several bobwhites flew up, a family of them. They had bedded down for the night. There wasn't any coyote or fox or anything I could see to scare them up." "Is that all?" "No, sir. Old Whizzer here was trailing along behind me, and he growled and just kept growling and looking over toward where those bobwhites flew up." "It doesn't sound too good, does it?" Mr. Conway said. "Better put someone on guard for the night." When Reed heard about it, he sent a message to his company of rangers, who were camped about 10 miles east of the ranch. All the saddled horses were tied between the house and the kitchen, which on the Conway ranch, as on many others, was separate from the living part of the house. "Better bring your saddles inside the kitchen," Reed suggested. "We don't want to find ourselves afoot if the Comanches come." Father Conway sat beside the fire with a rifle across his knee until midnight. Then Charlie Bjorn took over until morning. None of them took off their clothes. No light was allowed. It was still dark and Thad was asleep when Charlie gave the signal. "Everybody up! They're moving in on us." Thad pulled on his boots, which was all he had taken off, and tightened up the buckle on his gun belt and grabbed his hat. He reached the kitchen just as Reed and Giles came in. Travis came into the room a minute later. Ben Atkins had gone last night to summon the rangers. Outside the house, a horse's shrill whinny told them there were strange horses about. But there was no answering call from beyond the creek. "They've got their horses' noses pinched with some hackamore contraptions they make," Reed said. Thad knew what he meant. Comanches had a way of braiding knots into their horses' hackamores, just where with a pull the rider could pinch the nostril. It discouraged any horse from neighing or nickering. It was difficult enough for the horse to get his breath. "They're out there all right," Giles said. "It's a good thing we're all here. We can give them a stiff fight. The Comanches had no doubt been watching the house for some time, getting ready to make an all-out attack on the Conway family. But the boys, Reed and Giles, had arrived at night, and almost everybody had been out of sight with the measles for several days. Consequently, the Indians probably had no idea of the size of the family, or they would not have attacked. It was at the time just before dawn when everything is gray and dim. One can imagine all sorts of things, but cannot be sure anything he sees is real. Conway's house was built to resist assault. The shutters and doors were thick oak planks, and the walls of the kitchen, which was the first part of the house Pa had built, were of logs 18 inches thick. The rest of the rooms, built on each side of the wide hall, or breezeway, were of logs, too, though not such big ones as in the kitchen. Loopholes had been made in every wall and in the shutters so that those inside could see to fight back when the attack came. Each member of the family took up his station at one of these and waited. Ma sat ready to reload rifles and pistols for the others, but she also kept her own rifle at hand. They did not have long to wait. A sudden shower of arrows came from the darkness, plus a few scattered rifle shots. They've been trading the cattle and horses they stole from us for those Mexican rifles, Pa said sourly. Now they use them on us. Counting Mother, who was as good a shot as any of the others, and Charlie Bjorn and Bill Weaver, there were 8 rifles. They're trying to get to set the roof afire, Travis yelled from the front room. They're shooting burning arrows. Father laughed softly. Won't do them any good, he said. The roof was covered with wooden shakes, and underneath them was a thick layer of earth, like that on the brush arbors the Mexicans built. Members of the family were firing at the dim forms they saw now and again, but they were not able to tell whether they were scoring hits. They could not estimate the number of Comanches. The Indian yells, like the howling of coyotes, would lead one to think there were a dozen when there were only 1 or 2. But there were more than a dozen Comanches out there. The Conways were sure of that. But whether there were 25 or 100, no one could say. The Comanches must have been surprised at the force of accuracy of the return fire. Certainly they had not expected to find so many at the house. Then suddenly the attack ceased. They're still out there, Reed said with confidence, and they'll be back. They're mounting their ponies. He was right. After a little while, there was a savage scream and yelling. It seemed to Thad as though it would freeze the blood in his veins. It was the famous Comanche yell, the most blood-curdling set of noises human throats can make. It was meant to do just what it did do, scare the wits out of any poor soul who must listen to it. Thad's heart seemed to be standing still, but his older brothers, who had fought many a battle with the Comanches, and father, who had fought them all his life, batted not an eyelid. They poured a hail of lead into the stream of warriors, now more easy to see in the early morning light, as they charged the house, yelling, screaming, shooting. They're horseback now, Giles commented. This is their real try. If we can hold them now, we've got them licked. The lead of the defenders must have had some effect, for the yells of the Indians died as they circled away from the house to get ready for a new attack and to pick up their dead and wounded. An arrow had skimmed through a loophole in a window shutter and nicked Travis's shoulder. It bled some, but Mother applied a bandage, filled with the soot from the fireplace to stanch the flow. Travis was now back at his post at the loophole, his rifle popping along with the others. Giles, you, Travis, and Charlie come with me. We'll get our horses and go after those devils, Reed suggested. They're after our horses. We'll have to run them off, or they'll get every one of them. They had hardly saddled and mounted their horses when the Comanches renewed their attack. But at the same time, from east of the house came a Comanche yell from many voices. Undoubtedly, a large force was approaching from that direction. Thad was stiff with fright. Their doom was sealed. He was certain. Suddenly, Reed started waving his hat and yelling like a Comanche himself. There they come, he hollered. Those are my rangers. Now run, you Comanches, run. The Comanches did not need to be told the battle was over. They faded from the scene as suddenly as they had appeared. The men followed them for a little while, then came back to the house and made preparations for an expedition against the raiders. Reed's sergeant told Giles, "The company will be along in a few hours, Captain. We sent word to them. They were over on Blanket Creek, and it shouldn't take them long to get here. It is only 12 miles." "I'll wait for them, then," Giles said. "We'd better give those Comanches a good lesson while we're at it," muttered Reed. "Drive them out to this part of the country and try to give some of the ranchers' stock back, and maybe some captives. Yellow Cloud and his band will never give us peace until we do." Mother was getting breakfast for the men of the family, with Thad helping her. The rangers had fires going in the yard to cook their own meal. After eating, the men, leaving only Father, Ben, Atkins, and Thad behind, set out on their expedition. Even Travis went along. Giles stayed to wait for his rangers to come. After the excitement, those at home went about their chores as usual. Giles helped Thad with the milking, and Ben Atkins fed the stock. What would surely have been a massacre at the Conway Del Barro Ranch had the older sons not been at home with the measles turned into a defeat for the Comanches. Besides, the quick follow-up by the Rangers might prevent further trouble from the Indians and save some lives. No one was more anxious to put an end to the stealing and killing than Father Conway. "I've been fighting Indians all my life," he remarked, "from the Brazos to the Colorado, and my paw before me. I'm getting tired of it." At 10 o'clock that morning, Giles' company of rangers rode in, ready to join the pursuing party, the family supposed. But they brought news that changed the plans for the present. Giles stood and talked with his sergeant for some time before coming to the house. "I've got bad news for you all. Mighty bad news," he said. "A band of Comanches attacked the Branson Ranch this morning at daylight and massacred most of the family." Mother was the first to get her breath after the announcement. Thad seemed to have no feeling. He could not take in the full meaning of Giles' words. "All of them killed?" Mother asked. "The men don't know how many for sure," Giles said. "One of the Branson cowhands caught up with my men on their way here and told them, 'Ma, you better fix to come with us. We'll see what we can do, then we'll ride after the murderers.' It was probably a bunch split off from the ones that attacked us." "I reckon so," Giles agreed. "That's the way they work. I think all these are from Yellow Cloud's band. They hole up way out west, 100, maybe 300 miles from here. Move around a lot so we can't pin them down. The country is so big and wild, it is hard to find even a big band if They don't want to be found. They know we're coming, almost as soon as we know it ourselves, and they scattered into small bands. Well, I often wondered, Mother remarked, why, when a band makes a raid, our men can hardly ever find them. Johnny Ainsworth, Gal's Ranger Scouts, said we can find Comanches out there sometimes, but try pinning down the bands and the chief that's responsible for the raids. We just can't do it. I don't see why you can't, Mr. Johnny, Thad argued. Don't the horses have the ranchers' brands on them? The horses are traded over into New Mexico, and the branded cattle are either driven into Chihuahua or slaughtered by the time we find the guilty parties. When we do run onto them, they are just a band of innocent, hard-working Indians tending their own business. One eye. Johnny Ainsworth rode beside Thad on the way to the Branson Ranch. Thad had met the scouts many times and listened to his tales. Johnny could tell some that would put a boy's hair on end, too. When he was a boy of 8, his whole family had been killed by Comanches. He had managed to hide in the trail in the tall weeds, and they had overlooked him in the darkness. A neighbor had found him the next day and had raised him as his own. As a boy, he had been dedicated to the task of fighting Indians, and as soon as he was old enough, he began working as a scout with the soldiers and rangers. He had learned the Comanche language from captives and from scouts of other tribes. He had been captured by Comanches once and had been tortured before he could escape. The left side of his face was scarred, and one eye had been put out. He wore a black patch over the eye so that he had a sinister look until he spoke or smiled. Actually, he was a quiet, kind-hearted man. As they rode towards Branson's that day, he told Thad how he came to be scarred and how his parents had been killed by one of the Comanches. Thad said, I reckon you purely hate those Comanches, don't you, Johnny? He was surprised when Ainsworth shook his head. Maybe I ought to, Thad, he said, but I can't seem to hate anybody. It wears me out even not to like anyone. Those Comanches are living their lives like they have been raised to live. All I want to help get them under control so that they can be taught a better way. Then we can all live together peaceably. Thad could hardly believe the scout really meant what he was saying. But Mr. Johnny, I always heard. Mr. Johnny grinned at the boy. You always heard that I am a Comanche killer, didn't you? Thad was embarrassed, but he nodded. Well, that's hardly the fact, Thad, Mr. Johnny said. I've scouted for the soldiers and the rangers because I speak the Comanche's language, as well as any brave, and I've been the go-between in some of their talks and treaties. But I found out a long time ago that if I let myself hate them, I would be no better than a Comanche. But they hate us, Thad exclaimed. Yes, mostly they do, and sometimes it is with good reason, Thad. We Long Knives have not always acted like Christians in our dealings with them. They hate white folk, so they kill and torture them, men, women, and little children. If I would let myself feel like that toward them, I'd be as cruel and mean to them as they are to us. But I don't want to be like that. Thad thought over Mr. Johnny's words as they rode on. He still believed he could really hate anyone who had harmed those pretty little girls, Celia and Lissy. His heart was heavy with dread. He wondered what had happened to Stevie. How could even a Comanche harm a sweet little boy like Stevie Branson? Mr. Branson had finished his house, at least enough so they had been living in it several months. But now it was shambles. At first it appeared that no one was about, but as they went in the front door where the door had been broken and partially burned, they saw a form on the bed with a quilt drawn over it. Strangely, Thad would always carry his memory even the pattern of the quilts. It was a rose of Sharon, design such as he had seen on his mother's and Miss Ellie's beds. It was made with pretty pink and green and white pieces. Willie Branson sat on a broken chair beside the bed, his head in his hands. He looked up when Father and Mother Conway stood beside him. He motioned to the figure on the bed. Marcella. That was all he said. Where are the rest, Wiley? Father asked. Just then, Clem Howard, one of Wiley Branson's cowhands, came in from the back. Come on out here, and I'll tell you about it, Mr. Conway, he said, leading them toward the door. He nodded his head toward Willie Branson, who had dropped his head into his hands again. Before daybreak, Clem began, I heard the dogs barking. They made a terrible racket. I jumped up and put on my breeches and my boots and grabbed my gun belt. Wiley had heard them too, and he was in the kitchen when I got there. The other hands, Jed, Sully, and Bart, had all gone yesterday to round up some cows with little calves on the far side of Blue Mountain. They won't be back for several days. You two didn't go out when the dogs barked, did you? Father asked. Yes, Mr. Conway, we did. I told Wiley that was an old Indian trick. One or two Indians would get the dogs excited and then toll the men folk away from the house, while the rest of them did what they wanted to do at the house. That way they divided the strength of the family. And he wouldn't listen to you? Father asked. No, sir, he wouldn't, he said. Clem, you come with me. There are Indians out there in the pasture trying to run off our horses. So I couldn't do anything but go along. Kept looking back to the house, but I didn't see anything. And pretty soon we were out beyond the barns where the dogs were barking. Did you see any Indians? Father asked, as though he knew the answer already. Yes, sir, we did. Two of them. Young bucks they were, though we couldn't see them very well. They were at the front of a tree with sticks in their hands, tantalizing those dogs. I knew right then it was a trick and that it worked. We had been away from the house for at least 10 minutes. I yelled, Mr. Branson, they've tricked us. Look there. The flames were rising in the direction of the house. We ran back as fast as we could, and this is what we found. Clem spread his hands at the destruction around them. I see you put the fire out before it burned the whole house, Father said. Yes, sir. That was the first thing we did. It hadn't gotten much of a start on the house. It was mostly the kitchen, and it is pretty much of a wreck. Mother Conway began trying to straighten things out, but there was no place to begin. The whole house was in a state of confusion. Boxes were hacked open and their contents torn and scattered, and most of them taken. The bureau drawers were empty on the floor. The Comanches loved to strut around in white folks' clothes, especially women's dresses. Books and papers were torn and scattered as by a storm. In the kitchen, what was left of it, two bodies lay covered. Thad's mother would not let him look at them. They are Wash and Dulcie, Clement informed them. As they stood there, a groan came from one. Mother pulled away the quilt. Dulcie groaned again, then sat up, clutching at her head. Father and Clem carried her to a bed, and Mother began sponging her face. Thad stared aimlessly, poking around here and there inside and outside the house. He was hoping he could piece together, for his own satisfaction, what had become of the girls and Bo and Stevie, for they had not been seen since the attack. On the ground outside the window of the room where Bo and Stevie always slept, he found the stuffed ragged horse that had been Stevie's inseparable companion. Had they dragged him out of this window to his death? He stood and held the toy horse in his hand, wondering where Stevie was and whether he was still alive. I don't care what Johnny Ainsworth says, Thad said to himself. I hate those Comanches. I purely hate them, and I'll kill every one of them if I can get my hands on.